class, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about unions and collective bargaining. This is chapter 14 in the textbook. What is a union? Well, a union is a collective organization with the primary objective of improving the well-being of their members. The objective is met through collective bargaining, and the outcome is an agreement. So the firm and the workers work out an agreement through negotiations that specifies wages, benefits, and many other aspects of the employment relationship, such as vacation time, such as conditions for firing in the case of misconduct, promotions, etc. There are two basic types of unions: craft unions, which represent workers in a particular trade or occupation. So this could be something like the printing occupations, construction occupations. There are many of these types of trades, and many of them are unionized. Industrial unions represent all workers in a particular industry, and unlike the first one, it's regardless of occupation. So these would be such industries as automobiles, steel, and forest industry, and many more. Unions also have additional roles. It is common for there to be close ties between unions and social democratic political parties, especially in Western Europe, but even in Canada, the union movement provides financial and other support for the New Democratic Party. It's not unsurprising that unions tend to try and influence the government in power, and accordingly have been involved in various forms of consultation and collaboration with government, and even in some cases. However, the focus here in our lecture will be on the major function of Canadian unions, which is to represent their members in the collective bargaining process with their employers. So we're going to talk a moment about union membership and union density in Canada. In fact, the beginning part of this lecture will be a discussion of the nature and significance of unions and collective bargaining in Canada. In this table here, we have four columns. We have the year, and we're going to look at 1920, 2015. The second part of this table is on the next slide. The second column is union membership. So this is the absolute number of union members in Canada, and it's measured in thousands. The second column has data on union membership as a percentage of the civilian labor force, and the last column has information on union membership as a proportion of civilian non-agricultural paid work. So this measure excludes from consideration the self-employed and those who are employed in agriculture. And if we look, we can see that there's been substantial increases in either one of these measures from 1920 up until the 1960s. For example, the measure here, union membership as a percentage of the civilian labor force, increased from 9% in 1920 to almost 23% or 24% roughly in 1905. And if we look at just union membership of paid workers, non-agricultural paid workers, it went from 16% to 30% over this time period. As will be discussed shortly, there were a lot of changes in terms of the legal context of unions in the 1940s and 50s, which explains, or partially explains at least, some of these increases that we see in this time period. Now, if we look at the time period 1970 to 2015, overall unionization in Canada remained somewhat stable. There was a slight fall or a slight decrease when we look at either of the last two measures. For example, in 1970, if we're thinking of non-agricultural paid workers, the proportion went from 33.6 to 30.6 in 2015. So we see that the overall absolute numbers have been increasing, but at a slightly slower rate, and such that when you look at the proportion of non-agricultural paid workers, it fell slightly, and that is also true for this category here, where we're just looking at union membership overall as a percentage of the civilians. Let's talk a moment about the legal framework. So there are three main phases in which the legal framework in Canada has changed, or three main key time periods that we're going to focus on discussing. First is prior to Confederation. Essentially, before Confederation, the law has discouraged collective bargaining. Essentially, judges interpreted the common law to hold that collective action by employees was an illegal action, and in fact a criminal action. The second phase, which began in and around the 1870s, was deemed a neutral phase. So the law was essentially neutral to collective bargaining. Many of the restrictions on collective action were removed. However, the law did not encourage or facilitate unionization. This neutral stance lasted in Canada until around 1944, when the wartime labor relations regulations were enacted. In this period, labor law facilitated union formation and, in turn, encouraged the spread of collective bargaining. So this was a turning point in the legal framework in terms of unions in Canada. At first, this focused mainly on private sector workers, but within about 10-15 years, the public sector unionization was also encouraged in the public sector. The Canadian labor relations policy that emerged in the 1940s had 6 features. 1. Workers have the right to join and form unions as long as they met the statutory definition of an employee. 2nd, collective bargaining rights are protected under unfair labor practices legislation. So when a contract is negotiated, the agreement is protected under legislation from the government. 3rd, a system defining bargaining representation was successfully established. 4, the union is considered an exclusive bargaining representative of the workers. 5, unions and employers were required to bargain in good faith. And lastly, the rights and obligations were administered and enforced usually by a labor relations board, but in some cases the court. An important note to point out is that the differences between the provinces and federal government. Generally, labor relations, the jurisdiction for labor relations is or rests primarily with the province. Only roughly 10% of unionization is related to federal work. These would be, for example, employees of Crown corporations, rail, air, shipping, and transportation. There are 2 main measures of the extent of unionization. So if we're interested in measuring density, the first measure is called union density, and it defines the union membership as a percentage of paid work. In Canada, this is roughly about 34%. In another definition, it looks at the collective agreement coverage. So this is the percentage of paid workers whose wages and working conditions are covered by a collective agreement. And this number is also about 34% in Canada. In Canada, these definitions are roughly similar because the coverage or union density, these 2 measures are roughly the same thing because they're narrowly focused, where in some countries, alternatively, you could have people in a union, but the coverage will result in, or the collective agreement will not only cover the unionized worker, but extends out to other workers. So here we have some data on union density, and has our 2 measures of union density and collective agreement coverage for selected OECD countries. So we have Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Sweden, United Kingdom, and the United States. And we're looking at both measures in 2 periods, in 1980 and 2010. If we look at Canada, we see that between 1980 and 2010, either of the measures changed very little. In both cases, they had a slight decline. So if we're looking at the union membership as a percentage of paid workers, it went from 34 to 27%. If we're looking at our collective agreement coverage measure, it went from 37% to 29%. Some other interesting, the data in this table also highlights some other interesting remarks. There are also some interesting patterns if we look across countries. If we look at, for example, Denmark and Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, their unionization rates are much, much higher than Canada. If we look at Denmark, it goes from 79 to 67 between 1980 and 2010, but still it's 67% in 2010. In terms of the collective agreement coverage, that's as high as 83% in 2010. And we have similar figures, slightly higher in Sweden. Now, if you look at, say, France has much lower union membership as a percentage of paid workers. However, when we look at the other measure, collective agreement coverage as a percentage of paid workers, it is much higher. That's because many of the workers, they don't necessarily need to be part of a union, but the collective agreement extends to more than just the unionized workers. If we look also at the table, we see that the United States has some of the lowest rates of unionization. In this chart, we look at the difference in union density over time between Canada and the United States. The measure that we're using here is the non-agricultural paid work. So the union density is the percentage of non-agricultural paid workers that are unionized. And we're looking at the period from 1920 to 2015. And as you can see by looking at the chart, the Canada and the US move in a very similar pattern up until towards the end of the 1960s. And then afterwards, there is quite a large divergence between the 2 countries, with unionization rates remaining quite high in Canada, but falling substantially in the United States. A leading explanation for this divergence is the movement away from manufacturing in the US towards a more service-oriented economy. For more information, please see Exhibit 14.1 in the textbook. This is Table 14.2. Here we're looking at union membership and collective agreement coverage, so we're looking at our measures of density, but now we're looking at them stratified by gender and by age. And we can see here that there isn't a very large difference between unionization between the gender. Roughly the amount of females, the density among females is slightly higher than males. And if we look at age groups, unionization density seems to be higher with age, with the highest rates between 45 and 54. Young people 15 to 24 are least likely to be represented by a union. And union density seems to increase by education. Here we can see that roughly under 20% of people or workers who have less than a high school education are unionized. That increases slightly when we get high school graduates, and it increases about 10 percentage points more, depending on the measure, when we start looking at people with post-secondary diplomas. Or there is some slight variation in union density across the provinces. The province with the highest amount of unionization density is Quebec, at 36.1 and 39.4% for the respective measure. The lowest province is Alberta, with only a 21.8 and 23.5% density rates for the respective measure. If we look at work status, either part-time or full-time, we clearly see that full-time workers are more likely to be unionized. The difference is roughly 10 percentage points. If we look at the sector of the economy, either public or private, the public sector is substantially more likely to be unionized than the private sector. We can see, if we're looking at our union member measure, we can see that, and this is the percent of the civilian labor force that's unionized, we can see that public sector has a 70.4% density rate compared to private sector. So substantial differences between the public and private sector. And if we look at the size of the workplace, we see that the larger the workplace, the larger the rates are of unionization. And if we look at the job status, so if we're looking at a temporary job or a permanent job, the difference is very slightly less for those in a temporary job. So here are some of the key takeaways from the prior system. So first of all, we know that a union is an exclusive bargaining representative for all employees in the bargaining union, and the extent of union organization in Canada varies considerably by industry, occupation, region, and individual employer or employer characteristics. Unionization is highest in nursing and blue-collar occupations, and industry differences are also substantial. For example, we saw that the unionization rates or density rate in the public sector is much larger than the private sector, and full-time workers and workers above 40 are much more likely. So we're going to now look at unionization in the context of our supply and demand framework. So when we think of demand, we're thinking of the demand for union representation, and it depends on the expected benefits and costs of union representation. Now, what about supply? So if we think of the unions, they're going to be supplying representation, and that of course is going to depend on the contract administration activities from the union leaders and staff. In terms of the demand for union representation, what are the benefits? So obviously the demand for workers want to be part of the collective bargaining process. In order for them to demand that, there must be some benefits. Well, what are the benefits? Well, the benefits are in many cases higher wages, other non-wage benefits, greater employment security, and protection from arbitrary treatment by management. So within a collective agreement, for example, the employer cannot just let go an employee without reason. If you're not covered by a collective agreement in Ontario anyway, you can be fired without reason. That doesn't stop you from suing for wrong dismissal, but the management does not need to provide a reason to let go. But if you're part of a collective agreement, that is different, and there is an agreement between the employer and the employees, the collective agreement, which would specify how or why someone could be fired or let go from the position. They also tend to result in higher wages because of the negotiation process. Now, with a union, the workers have some representation. They don't just have the wages given, they can work collectively and have some negotiating power. Of course, it all depends on profits of the firm and how much bargaining power each of the two sides have. If a firm has very, very high profits and the workers have high productivity, then you can see that the workers may be able to negotiate a much higher wage than in the case of not having a union at all. So these represent the factors behind the demand for union representation. Now, But what about the costs? Well, to be part of a union, you have to pay union dues. The union needs to secure some sort of financing to run its operations. And if you're part of a union, every paycheck, there's a certain amount deducted from your paycheck that goes towards the union. There's also time involved in union activities, and there is the potential loss of income. It's possible that if the union is able to negotiate higher wages, in the long run, the firm might end up substituting capital for labor, and they might also just generally hire less workers because the cost is now higher. So there is a potential of loss of income due to job loss. What about the supply for union representation? Well, let's consider the supply side of it. So administering collective agreements is costly. It's costly for the union. Reallocation of resources to yield a higher return. Unions need to allocate their scarce resources to activities that are expected to yield the highest return. Of course, these are measured in terms of the union objectives. Of course, organizing new workplace activities will depend on a number of factors. We can see here, just looking at these and discussing the supply side, that it makes sense that unions would want to target workplaces where there's a high level of profit for the firm that's hiring the workers, and a workplace with a large number of members in which to collect union dues from. Thus, it's not surprising that we see high unionization rates among workers in the public sector, and we also saw earlier in the statistic that the union density tends to be higher in firms with a larger number of employees. If you consider, for example, an independent restaurant that, say, has maybe 20 employees, it would be not a good use of the union's scarce resources to try and unionize those workers, because the union dues that they're going to get out of those members is going to be quite small. You only have 20 employees times maybe $100 a month, and especially at first it would require a lot of effort on the part of the union. They'd have to allocate a lot of their scarce resources into a union drive and to attempt to get that particular location unionized. And you also have the issue that a small restaurant, 20 employees, the profit or markup on the profits of the restaurant aren't going to be very high. Restaurants are a very low margin business, and the owners of the restaurant probably aren't making, a relatively large sum of money. And so in that case, they're not going to be able to provide that much of an increase in wages to the workers, or increases in any of the other aspects of, or any other benefits in that employer-employee relationship. So in terms of the supply side, we see that there's the union, just like any other organization, just like a business, has scarce resources, and it wants to allocate them in a way to be able to provide the benefits in terms of their objectives. So their objectives are usually to increase the well-being of workers, and so they want to be able to use their scarce resources in a way which they can maximize that objective and have it realized to as many employees as possible. And so again, that's why you can see from the supply side that unions would tend to target larger employers with hundreds of employees rather than small workplaces. And they would also want to target companies or the public sector where the firm itself, the organization, has very high profits. And in the case of the government, stable income from taxes on its citizens. Certainly, this demand and supply framework provides a useful conceptual model in which to analyze the extent of unionization at a point in time and even in changes over time. The central concept is that the extent of unionization depends on the choices made by employees, the organizational and contract administration activities of union leaders, and the actions of employers. The bottom line is that the supply of union organizational and contract administration effort will be high where the per worker cost of organization and representation is low. So again, the demand for unionization will be high if the perceived benefits among the workers are very high. More specifically, the net benefits from joining a union, if they're perceived high, then there's going to be a very large demand for representation. And the supply of representation will be very high, especially if the organizational and contract administration effort will be high where the per worker cost of organization and representation is low. So let's look at the following example. This example will help us understand how much of the observed change in unionization over time can be attributed to changes in the structure of the economy and the labor force. The data here in the table show the composition of employment and union density by broad industrial group over the time period from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. So let's look more closely at this table. So in the left here we have the goods producing industries and the service producing industry, and then we have all industries. So the first panel here we have the percentage of employment of paid workers. So our denominator here is paid workers, and we have the base period, which was the mid-1970s, and then the final period, which was the mid-1990s. And then in this last panel we have union density in the base period and the final period. So let's first note that overall union density is a weighted average of union density in each sector, with the weights of course being the share of employment in each sector. So the union density in the base period is obtained by multiplying 0.32, which is the percentage of workers in the base period who are in the goods producing industries, times the density in the base period for goods producing industries. So 0.32 times 0.42 or 43%, plus we'll do the same. We know that 68%, or the proportion, is 0.68 in the service producing industries. We're going to take that and multiply it by the union density in the base period. And so when we multiply this out and add it up, we get 31.4%. So that's the 31.4% here. So the weighted average for all industries is 31%, and that's the measure of union density in the base period. For the final period, we do a similar exercise. We know that in this period, in the the proportion of people, or the percentage of employment of paid workers in the goods producing industries, was 24%, and in the service producing industries was 76%. So we're going to use these as weights. These are indicated here, 0.24, 0.76, and then we're just going to multiply those by the union density in the final period, so 38 and 32. So we're going to end up with a number somewhere in between here, and because this sector here has a higher weight, we're going to be closer to the 32. The end result is that we have 33.4% as the union density in the final period if we're looking at all industries. So between the base period and the final period, we can see that union density only increased by 2 percentage points. Now think of the following counterfactual question. Suppose that union density in each sector remained at its base period level, but that the composition of employment changed between the base and final periods as indicated above in the table. As such, we allow for structural change in the economy, that is the changing composition of employment, but we hold constant the propensity to unionize, the union density in each sector. Under this scenario, what would have been union density in the final period? So we could answer this question by doing the following calculation. So if the union density had remained the same, then we're going to be just considering the 43 and 26. And then we're going to use instead the final period percent of employment of paid workers. So we're going to use the 0.24 and 0.76 as weights, and we're going to weight the base period union density 43 and 26. So if we calculate this, we get that the counterfactual union density would be 30.1. Okay, so in this case we're calculating what the union density would have been if the only change that occurred was this composition here, but the base period union density stayed the same. More formally, if union density in each sector had remained at a base period level, but the composition of employment changed and was in fact observed, union density in the final period would have been 30.1%. As a result, we can see that the change in union density due to structural change in the composition of employment is 30.1 minus 31.4. So the difference between those is negative 1.3%. So this is just the change in the union density as a result of the structural change in the composition of employment. We now have enough information to decompose the overall change of 2%. If you recall, we got 2% from these two figures here. In fact, these numbers were 31.4 and 33.4. And so we saw that the union density had increased 2 percentage points. Okay, so now we're going to decompose that 2%, which is 33 minus 4 minus 31.4, into that attributed to structural change, which we just calculated to be negative 1.3%. And the other component is due to changes changes in union density in each sector. So because the two components must equal 2%, then this second component must be 3.3%. So we've decomposed the 2% into the first component, which is negative 1.3%. So in terms of this increase, we actually had part of it that would be pulling it down, and so the other part must have pulled it up more than 2%, must hold it up by 3.3%. So the overall change of 2% can be decomposed into two terms. The first is related to the structural changes in terms of employment or composition of employment. That was the negative 1.3%. And the second term related to changes in the propensity to unionize, which is 3.3%. So there are substantial differences across industries in the context of union organization. So unions tend to be higher in larger firms, concentrated industries, capital-intensive production processes, and hazardous jobs. We can use the demand and supply framework to think about why this is the case. The first important concept to realize is that the per worker cost of union organizing is lower in larger establishments. So also, if you think about the high capital intensity in concentrated industries, that would imply labor costs are a small fraction of the overall total cost. So in that case, the labor demand would be more inelastic, which would increase the potential wage gain, right? You need to remember the incentives or perspective of the union. They want to target industries where they can get the most members and be able to fulfill their objective of increasing the overall well-being, and usually in terms of wages and employment. And so in these larger firms, there'll be some economies of scale, and that would reduce the per worker cost of union organizing. If you remember my example from before, where you're thinking of a small restaurant, clearly the net benefits for the union won't be as high as they would be in larger firms. And clearly in capital intensive production processes, then you have that labor doesn't make up as much of the total cost of production because a lot of the costs are related to capital. And so in that case, then the labor demand would be more inelastic. And of course, with hazardous jobs, that's going to increase the demand on the part of the members or workers to want to be part of a union, because it's going to likely be characterized by a greater demand for collective voice to represent workers' interests. There's just more of an incentive for them to be unionized and to be able to get protection in the result of, well, in the context of workplace safety. And of course, in concentrated industries, these tend to have some barriers to entry. So competition is lower, and usually in these industries, the profits could be higher. And so that gives the unions more of an interest in having them be members in the union, because there's a greater potential that they could actually increase their wage and overall well-being, which is the objective of the union. Now, in terms of personal characteristics, there's a number of them that affect the propensity to be a union member or to be represented by a union. So less union formation with part-timers. So there tends to be less union formation among part-time workers. And this is, kind of makes sense. The net benefits in terms of seniority provision, pension benefits, and other aspects are going to be lower for them if they're part of a union. There also tends to be an increase in the potential gain from unions in blue-collar jobs. So blue-collar jobs or blue-collar workers are more likely to demand union representation because of less identification with management and possibly a greater need for collective voice in the determination of working conditions. We can also think of union formation and age. There tends to be a concave relationship, meaning that at first, so when you were thinking of a younger age and getting older, at first the union formation increases at an increasing rate, and then it tapers off, and then it begins to decline. If you think about it, unions tend to increase the wages of those on the lower end of the wage distribution by a relatively large amount, and those in the upper tail of the wage distribution by a relatively smaller amount. So individuals whose earnings would be above average in the absence of a union are less likely to favor union representation. And a related issue is low-paying workers tend to be more interested in union formation. There tends to be more gains for them to be had. So now we're going to start looking at a model related to the theory of union behavior. So we're going to consider the union and its main objectives. So the main objectives are wages, employment of union memberships, and these are the two that we'll be focusing on. The factors that can affect these objectives are the price level, cost of living, the alternative wage, and employment. So in this model, we're going to be looking at the real wage and employment space. Okay, and the real wage we're looking at because that's how much the actual compensation will be for the workers. We want what they're getting paid, but we want to scale that with prices so it's in real terms. And then on the horizontal axis, we have employment. So we're going to depict the unions indifference curves, or their utility with indifference curves. And we're just going to assume for now that the utility function is a function of the real wage and employment. And so we can draw indifference curves in this space, and they're going to be downward sloping because a higher wage is going to be needed to compensate for lower employment, and they will have a concave shape as usual. Thus we're assuming diminishing marginal rate of substitution. And so we're also going to term these the ISO utility curves. And so they're going to look like this. Okay, again, if you think of a particular point here, if we were to reduce employment, the union would need the workers to have a higher real wage that aren't going to lose their employment in order to remain indifferent. So these curves, again, are indifference curves. We'll call them ISO utility curves because it's a little different than in the setup we had before with the labor leisure framework. So all along, every point on one of these curves represents a real wage and employment combination that keeps the union indifferent. So this point here where there's a very high real wage but less employment is indifferent to a much lower real wage and very large employment. So in this model, we're going to say that wage negotiation or market determined employment. We're going to say that unions negotiate wages and they're going to take into account the consequences. So in this first setup, we're saying that the unions are going to just negotiate the wage with the firm. Okay, and then once that wage is negotiated, the firm will decide what the employment level is. And of course, as we saw in earlier chapters, the firm is going to take the wages given and then maximize profits. So if you remember, the demand for labor curve was essentially the marginal revenue product curve. So here we're just doing that same procedure. We're going to say, okay, the firm's going to take a wage as given and then determine what the maximum employment level would be. And that would be obtained from the demand for labor curve, which is setting your wage equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. So the demand for labor curve in this case would be analogous to a budget constraint. So the union is trying to get the highest negotiated wage, but of course the constraint, they can't just get whatever wage they want, they have to take the firm's labor demand curve as a constraint. And so the equilibrium here is the tangent of the ISO utility curve with the demand for labor curve. So let's take a look at a diagram. So here we have the demand for labor curve, okay? And we're again in our employment and real wage space. This here is the real wage that workers could get, the alternative real wage, okay? So these workers could get paid this elsewhere, okay? So actually, we'll talk about that in a moment, but let's first look at an indifference curve. So this indifference curve passes through this point here and this point here. And so this point here refers to a particular wage and employment combination, and so does this one. Now, would this be the maximum? Would this be where the union would want to, would the union just want to choose either one of these? Well, no. Well, what about this indifference curve that's up here? Would the union want to choose, say, point A3? Well, no, that's not possible because of the demand for labor as a constraint. So the optimum then is where the union's indifference curve is just tangent to the constraint, which is the demand for labor curve. So this point here represents the best, or what the union would want given these conditions. They would want this wage and employment combination. There are some special cases of indifference curves or isoutility curves for unions. So let's suppose that the objective of the union is to maximize only the wage rate. So they don't care about employment. So in that case, we would end up with just horizontal straight lines. So there wouldn't be a relationship between wages and employment. It would just be a horizontal straight line. And we'll see these in a diagram in a moment. The other option would be if they just cared about employment. And so in that case, it would the indifference curves were just going to be vertical straight lines. And the other options are to maximize the real wage bill. In this case, they're just interested in maximizing the wages times the level of employment. Okay, and you would end up with a rectangular hyperbola where union attaches weight to both wages and employment. And just to be clear, the wage bill is actually what the total labor income would be, because we're taking the wages and multiplying it by the employment. And also, if we think about this, then the utility then would just be equal to the wage times employment. So if we hold utility fixed and then have the wage, well, in this case the real wage, if we isolate that, it will be equal to a constant divided by the employment. And so that's why we'll get a rectangular hyperbola shaped isoutility curve. One of the real disadvantages of this objective is that it ignores the alternative wage. So in certain situations, you could have the wage being very low and then very large employment, and it could be the case that that would end up maximizing the total labor income. But the problem is that no workers would want to work for this firm if the wage was less than what the alternative wage was. It's essentially saying that the union would be interested in having the real wage actually, or it could potentially be the case that the union would allow for the wage to fall below the alternative wage because they can get a large increase in employment, which would make the overall total labor income higher. So the other special case is to maximize the real economic rent. So economic rent would be the difference between the union wage and the alternative wage. This setup is analogous to the profit maximization of a monopolist. The alternative wage is the opportunity cost for all of the members. So economic rent is analogous to total revenue, which is the wage times the employment. That would be the total income for the members, minus the total cost. Here the total cost is the opportunity cost, so it would be the alternative wage times the level of employment. And again, these iso-indifference curves would be, or iso-utility curves would be also rectangular hyperbolas, similar to the previous special case. This is perhaps the most plausible out of all of these special cases. It would be even more plausible if there was some way for, or some mechanism in which the rents could be shared with the members or workers who would be unemployed. So let's take a look at these on a diagram. So this is the first one where the union just cares about maximizing the wage rate, and so the indifference curves would just be horizontal. Okay, so all they care about is the wage. So it doesn't matter what employment is. So employment could increase a lot, but we'll just be moving along the iso-utility curve, and it would be unchanged because all they care about is the wage. If they only care about employment, we have a similar idea, but there's going to be vertical. So we can increase the wage as much as you want, but all they care about is employment. So for a fixed employment level, if we increase the wage, they're going to be indifferent all along this line because they don't care about the wage. And the minimum here would be the alternative real wage. And for the third option or special case where they maximize the wage bill, the indifference curves will look like this because they care about both of the items here. So we're going to have more well-behaved iso-utility curves. And similarly for D, we'll have regular hyperbolas, or these are well-behaved indifference curves, but they're going to asymptote at the alternative wage, because in this case the idea is to maximize economic rent, which is the difference between what the wage the union can get and the alternative wage. So we're not incorporating into the model anything below the alternative wage. So what are the union constraints? The union can't just choose whatever wage and employment outcomes it desires, right? The union must negotiate with the firm. So it can't just unilaterally choose a wage and then have the firm just choose its employment. It has to negotiate the wage. The union must take into account the consequence of its decisions, meaning that when it chooses the wage, the firm then is going to choose the employment. And so depending on whatever wage that is, the employment loss could be large or low. It depends on the elasticity of demand for labor. So the firm, obviously, as I mentioned, is going to choose the employment level where profits are maximized. So the consequence would be whatever the wage they negotiated is. It could have the unintended consequence of reducing perhaps employment by too much. We're going to represent firms' isoprofit curves in our diagram. So we're essentially putting in the firm's profit into the diagram, and we'll see why we're doing that in a moment. Isoprofit curves are combinations of wages and employment rates that yield equal profits. In this case, lower curves will imply higher profits. If you just think about a given employment level, then the lower the wage, the more profit the firm is going to make. So as we go down, we're increasing the amount of profit. And so isoprofit curves that are lower represent higher profit. The maximum is going to be obtained. So the isoprofit curves are going to be concave shape, and the maximum is going to occur on the labor demand curve. And that's easy to see. We have wages on the left, and so the firm is going to take the wages given and want to set it equal to its marginal revenue product of labor, which is the demand for labor curve. And so given a wage, the best or maximum profits would be for the firm to choose an employment level on its labor demand curve. Okay, so the maximum is attained where the isoprofit and labor curves intersect at the maximum of the isoprofit curve. And we'll look at these in a moment, so that will be more clear. With increasing employment, profit, of course, will decrease for a given wage because the maximum is on the labor demand curve. If we hire more workers than the maximum, we're obviously going to be reducing profit. So with a higher wage, profit falls for a given employment. Let's look at these on a diagram. So these are different isoprofit curves, okay? So if you think of this wage here, suppose this is the negotiated wage with the union. So the firm then is going to take this wage. Are they going to set it to point E and hire this amount of workers? Well, no, because they can get on a higher indifference curve if they, for example, chose this point F and hired this many workers. But they can even do better. They can go to point B and hire E star, which is their labor demand curve. Remember, the labor demand curve is obtained from the profit maximizing behavior of the firm given wages. So that's the competitive market outcome, right? Where we have the firm takes the wages given and then just maximizes their profit by choosing an employment level such that the given wage is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, so B would be the optimum given this wage. So isoprofit curves then show different combinations of wages and employment that keep the profit the same. Okay, so moving all along here, these would all yield the same profit as point B. Okay, the firm's not going to choose G and hire this amount of workers at this wage because it would end up on a higher isoprofit curve. And we mentioned that the isoprofit curves, when they increase, they reflect lower profits. When they decrease, they reflect higher profit. And again, it's easy to see that. Let's just fix the employment level at, say, E star. And so we have a number of people we're going to employ. Well, for higher and higher wages, we're obviously going to have lower and lower profit. For lower wages, if it costs less to hire this amount of employees, then our profits are going to increase. So profits go in the downward direction. And it's useful to point out that if we're in a competitive product market, then the firm would need to earn at least a normal profit. So we want economic profits to at least be zero. So whatever the wage would be, it would have to correspond with a profit that is higher an economic profit that is greater than zero. So if suppose this represented the zero profit isoprofit curve, then the wage could not be anything more than this amount. Okay, so again, isoprofit curves plot combinations of wages. In this case, we're talking about the real wage and employment that yield equal profits. Isoprofit curves are upward sloping to the left until they hit the maximum of the demand curve, and then they fall. Okay, and that's really easy to see. For a particular wage, the maximum profit is on the demand for labor curve. Okay, if they were to take this wage as given and hire more than this amount of workers, they're obviously going to have lower profit because this refers to the maximum. Okay, so now let's look at the union, or the firm and the union's preferred wage employment outcome. So we have our union. We know that their optimum point would be where their indifference curve or ISO utility curve is tangent to the labor demand curve. And so given the demand for labor curve, this is the wage that the union would want. Okay, and now we're going to suppose that this ISO profit curve here corresponds to zero economic profits. Okay, so this puts an upper limit on the wage. Okay, so W0, which corresponds to the amount that would be employed at this wage, is the upper limit because the ISO profit at this point is consistent with the zero economic profit condition. So any wage above would result in the firm having zero economic profits, and then they would want to exit this industry. Okay, so that's the upper limit. That's what the union would want. Now here, this is where the firm would want to be. They would want to pay just the alternative wage. They don't want to pay anything more than what the workers could get elsewhere. And so this would correspond to this ISO profit curve and this amount of employment. So this is where the firm would want to be. This is the wage the firm would want to pay. This is the wage the union would want to pay. And so this range here is the negotiation range. So the firm cannot pay wages below the alternative wage. The firm prefers I subscript F, and the union prefers I subscript U in the diagram we just looked at. The bargaining range then would be WA to WU, and the wage rate will lie in the bargaining range. And so with the level of employment determined by the labor demand function. So they would negotiate the wage, the firm would maximize its profits by selecting E star, and that would be the outcome. So now we're going to relax the demand constraint. So unions can alter the set of available options by altering the following constraints. And just to note, the theory outlined so far does not predict a unique wage and employment outcome. We just had a range. To complete the theory, we'll need an explanation of the bargaining outcome of the two parties. Let's look at two closely related possibilities. The first is that the union may attempt to alter the constraint. So again, the union would want to do that in order to be able to get its preferred wage and employment combination. So one of the things they can do is try to make the demand for labor more inelastic. And of course, if it's more inelastic, for any given wage increase, the amount of employment loss will be less. And other things they could try to do is alter the constraint of the product market. Remember, the demand for labor is a derived demand, and so the product market will affect, whatever goes on in the product market will affect the demand for labor. And so one thing they could do is try to support or lobby for quotas or tariffs, because these will protect the domestic market from competition and make the demand more inelastic. If there's more competition, more firms selling a similar product, there's more substitutes, then the demand for labor, the demand for the product will be more elastic, and so will the demand for labor. They will have opposition to any regulations, and they will also want to promote policies that increase the alternative wage, which would be things like minimum wage laws or also full employment policies. And of course, they would also try to limit immigration, as this could potentially drive down the alternative wage. The second thing that we're going to look at is negotiating over both the wage and employment. And we're actually going to see that it can be mutually advantageous. So in this case, the union is negotiating over both wages and employment rather than before where they just negotiated the wage and left the number or amount of employment up to the firm. So let's refresh our memory on what a Pareto inefficient means. So a Pareto inefficient outcome would be a situation where someone can be made better off without someone else being made worse off. Okay, and we'll see that a Pareto efficient wage employment outcome would occur when the union's indifference curve is tangent to the firm's isoprofit curve. So let's look at our diagram again. So here we have the wage the union would want. Okay, that's at point A. We have the alternative wage. This is what the firm would want to pay, and this would be their isoprofit curve. Now, if we look at the wage and employment contracts along the demand for labor curve, we can see that all of these will be Pareto inefficient. Well, why is that? Well, let's just consider first point A. Okay, so at this point, we would have the firm's isoprofit curve. Okay, now let's look to the right. Are there any points or wage and employment combinations that would make both parties better off, or at least one better off without making the other worse off? Well, we can clearly see that there are. We remember that isoprofit curves, lower isoprofit curves, result in higher profit. So any point in this I guess you call it a envelope will yield a higher profit to the firm. But also any point in here would yield higher utility for the union. Okay, so for example, compared to the point A on the labor demand curve, both parties would be better off at a point A prime because this will yield higher utility and profit. So higher utility to the union and higher profit to the firm. So in fact, any point in this area here would result in a Pareto improvement for both parties. If we look at any point on the labor demand curve, we can find a similar situation. For example, point B, this area here would represent Pareto improvements. So now what's the Pareto efficient? So even at this point A prime, it's not Pareto efficient because you could probably still do better, right, for both of the firms. So it is where you keep going, moving down the isoprofit and moving the union's indifference curve up until they're tangent, because if they're both tangent, then you know at that point you can't make anyone better off without making someone worse off. Okay, so the set of Pareto efficient wage employment contracts, we're going to call that the contract curve and represent it with CC prime. This would be the locus of points at which the union indifference curve is tangent to the firm's isoprofit curve. And so it would be, for example, one point would be this point here, A double prime, but we can imagine, moving down, you can imagine there being a whole bunch of different indifference curves and isoprofit curves, and they're all being tangent. So we would just pick different points on the curve and do a similar exercise. And so what we would get would be the contract curve. And the reason why, and so this is always going to be to the right of the demand for labor curve, and that's because the union's indifference curves are downward sloping, and so this set of tangencies must occur on the right of the labor demand curve, right? These are downward sloping. This is downward sloping only after the labor demand curve, so you're only going to get these two things being tangent to each other to the right of the demand. So as I mentioned, in those shaded areas, the parties are better off. So A double prime, as we saw, was a Pareto efficient outcome. The outcome is where the union indifference curve is tangent to the firm's isoprofit curve. So in this case, you can't make one of the parties better off without making the other party worse off. So the locus of Pareto efficient wage employment outcomes is called the contract curve, and we label that C prime. And again, the contract curve must lie to the right of the labor demand curve. So in terms of a summary, both the firm and the union can benefit from negotiating a wage and employment outcome on the contract curve. And so, this could lead to better outcomes than if the union and firm just negotiated on the wage. Now, of course, the two parties are going to have differing views about which particular outcome on the contract curve would be chosen. Moving up the CC prime curve, the union becomes better off while the firm will be worse off, and the other way around, vice versa. But as before, there is a bargaining range where the parties end up within that range depends on their relative bargaining strengths. The lower limit of the bargaining range is determined as before. That would be the alternative wage. It can't be lower than that or the firm won't be able to attract any workers. The upper limit is determined by the zero economic profit condition. As we saw, that's where we're talking about the isoprofit curve, that is the break even or the curve that represents zero economic profit. And so the wage can't be any higher than W0, which is associated with that, because then the firm would have negative economic profits, and so it should want to exit the industry. So there are some obstacles, though, to reaching efficient contracts. Of course, a lot of our assumptions here were that the information was available to both parties. Of course, in reality, the information needed may not be available. An agreement about employment could be difficult to enforce. If you think about it, they could negotiate that, but there could be ways in which the firm could maybe get around that. There are other, there's a whole host of rules about why someone can be let go or laid off. So they could argue that they are in agreement to the collective agreement, but they're letting these people off for maybe other reasons that are in the contract that make sense. So, it could be difficult to enforce. Also, changes in market and economic conditions or the employer's financial viability. If there's changes in this could result in the firm not abiding by the contract because they can't because of the financial constraints. And then also there's going to be costs associated with monitoring and enforcing these efficient contracts. So in many settings, these could be very expensive. So here in this diagram, we have our demand for labor curve. We know the contract curve will lie to the right. And so the contract curve or set of efficient wage employment contracts is here. Okay, it's always to the right of the demand for labor curve. But because of costs of writing, monitoring, and enforcing contingent contracts, it may prevent the two parties from reaching the contract curve in all situations. So they could maybe end up on some curve like this, which would be less efficient. So rather, the firm and union may agree to a set of approximately efficient contracts, and that would be denoted by this line here. And they could negotiate work rules that restrict the firm's ability to control employment, but not fully. And so each point on for each point on the labor demand curve, there is a wage employment outcome on this curve that both the firm and the union would prefer. So efficient versus inefficient contracts. So the two alternative models of the determination of wages and employment in unionized setting have been outlined. So we talked about the labor demand curve model, which just involved the two parties negotiating the wage rate and the firm setting the employment. And then the second one was the efficient contracts model, which involved two parties negotiating on both the wage rate and the employment. So which of these two models applies in any particular setting is an empirical question. The empirical evidence based on the labor demand curve model appears to be in agreement on several issues. One is that the union has a dominant power and can determine the wage. Second, union places a high weight on employment, and unions' preferences display diminishing marginal rate of substitution, and union preferences tend to be sensitive to the alternative wage. Now let's just talk for a moment about union bargaining power. The term bargaining power arises frequently when we talk about unions and the firm union bargaining situations. Like many terms, it's used widely, but its precise meaning is not always clear. So in this section, we're going to just look at two possible meanings of union bargaining power. For simplicity, we're going to assume that the two parties negotiate over wages alone, leaving the firm to set the employment level. Okay, so given that assumption, the first meaning could be that union bargaining power is related to the elasticity of labor demand. So the more inelastic, the more power the union has to raise the wage rates. Okay, so the more inelastic the demand curve, the more possibilities exist that they could get a higher wage. And then the second meaning is union bargaining power associated with just the ability to raise wages. Okay, so we have two different situations. One is that the possibility for the union to get higher wages is there, so we would say that they have bargaining power. And the second meaning, this is more related to its ability to negotiate. So a powerful union is one that can obtain a negotiated outcome close to its most preferred outcome. And so this aspect of union power depends not exactly on the elasticity of labor demand, but more on the relative costs of disagreement to each party. Remember, when you're talking about negotiations, there's a cost to disagreement for each party. And if we think of the typical situation, we have a firm and we have employees or workers. If they go on strike and they don't make an agreement, they both have costs. The firm loses profit because they're not producing anything, and the unions lose out on, the workers and the union lose out on a wage. So there's a very strong incentive for both of them to make sure they come up with an agreement. Of course, if there are differences in those costs, if there's some way that if the business could be run by the management, and so they're not going to lose that much if the workers leave, then the power of the union is going to be that high. So in this situation, we're saying that they would have a lot of power if the costs, say, to the firm were maybe even higher than the union, or they're just very high or similar, because in that case they have a lot of power. Because if they do decide to go on strike, the cost to the other party, the firm, would be very large. So let's represent these two different situations. So it's possible for a union to be powerful according to one definition, but weak according to the other. So if we look at this first panel here, we have a very inelastic demand for labor curve, okay? And the optimum wage for the union would be this here, WU, okay? And so in this case, that would be where they'd want to go, and it's possible to get, to that point, but they may not be good. They may not have the ability to raise wages. So here the union is going to be willing to raise the wages substantially because of the inelastic demand curve. They're not going to lose that much employment to get this much higher wage. So the union would be willing to raise wages substantially because the demand for labor is relatively inelastic. But they may not be able to negotiate as well. And so let's suppose that they're only able to negotiate this wage here. So in this case, they seem to have a lot of power, but because they're weak on the other power, they actually are not capable of getting the wage that they want for their union membership. In the second diagram, we have an elastic demand curve. And so in this case, if the higher the wage, the consequences here are very high when the wage is higher in terms of employment. So when you have an elastic demand for labor curve, any reduction any increase in the wage will result in a much larger reduction in employment compared to this demand curve. And so given this elastic demand for labor curve, the union would prefer this point here. Okay, so they would prefer to have the wage just slightly above the alternative wage. If it goes too high, they're going to be losing a lot of employment. So this would be their opt. And then let's suppose, in terms of the second definition, this union is very good at being able to get the wage they want. So this union is not willing to raise wages substantially because the demand for labor is highly inelastic. But on the other hand, they're able to get the wage they want in terms of that measure. And so in this case, they're able to get the wage they want and they're happy. So you could just see this just sort of highlights that you need to be very clear on what the definition of union power is. So here, neither aspect of bargaining power alone ensures that the negotiated wage will be substantially higher than the alternative wage. It's not substantially higher here, and it's not substantially higher here. And in this case, they have inelastic demand. The demand for labor is inelastic. but they're still not able to get the wage to be that much higher than the alternative. So let's just talk for a moment about the strike threat. And I mean, this is the main source of bargaining power. The firm, of course, can also lock out employees, and if they do that, then the workers don't get paid. I mean, for collective agreements and the whole idea of having unions and a collective bargaining process, a key thing is that both sides lose if they don't come up with an agreement. And so that makes it so that the risk of going on strike or a lockout is low. And it increases the chances that they will come up with an agreement, because both will lose if they don't. So they need to be bargaining in good faith. So the strike threat is the primary source of bargaining power for the union. Another source of bargaining power is being able to restrict supply, and so craft unions tend to do this, so they can better raise wages artificially, because they're controlling entry to their craft. So of course, the less supply of labor for any given demand, the wages are going to be higher. They try to control the whole trade. It's almost as if they're trying to become a monopolist in terms of the the supply of this type of labor. And so they can set productivity related factors artificially high. Professional associations also do this. So they have control over the process of occupational licensing and certification. So maybe like electricians or doctors would fall under this. The supply of labor to the occupation then is restricted. And so, of course, the outcome is a higher wage, but more lengthy education periods. Okay, so let's finish up with some active learning questions. So the first question asks, the unionization rate will tend to be higher when all of the following apply except. So maybe you can pause the video, think of what the answer would be. Okay, so the answer here is the more competitive the product market. Okay, so the unionization rate will tend to be higher when all of the following apply except. Okay, one of the reasons you can know that concentrated industries tend to be more likely to be unionized, and they're not competitive. And the reason why it's more attractive for unions is because they can have higher profit, and so the chances of the union being able to get a wage higher than the alternative wage is better. Now, the overall strength of a union movement depends on all of the following factors except. So hit pause and then I'll tell you the answer. So the answer is E, the strength of the union movement in negotiating or in neighboring countries. So if we look at these, the overall strength of a union movement depends on all of the following factors except. So the economic environment, so that of course definitely would relate to the strength of a union movement. Of course, in a recession, the union isn't going to be as successful, whereas in a boom period it would. The political climate, of course. So remember, unions have an incentive to lobby the government for various things like tariffs and other policies that would make the demand for labor curve more inelastic. So depending on the government that's in power, that could result in them being more or less successful in doing that. The activities of employers is also important. And of course, the legal and regulatory climate in which unions must operate. And then the last one is the strength of a union movement in neighboring countries. Well, this doesn't really have much of an effect on the union movement within a particular country. The bargaining power that a union has is most closely related to, the correct answer is the elasticity of labor demand. An efficient contract in the Pareto sense occurs at the, so hit pause and I'll tell you the answer. So the answer is D, the point of tangency between the union's ISO utility or indifference curve and the ISO profit curve. Only at that tangency point can you not improve one of the parties without making the other worse off. Okay, and the last question. The bargaining range refers to which of the following is true? So the answer is E, the range for the negotiated wage such that the firm is not unprofitable and the workers receive at least the alternative wage. So if you remember in the diagram, it was between W subscript 0 and WA. W subscript 0 referred to the zero profit condition for the firm, so it can't be higher than that. And the alternative wage, W subscript A was the alternative wage that the workers could obtain, and so if the wage is less than that, then no one would want to work for the firm. So it has to be in that range. That's where they could feasibly bargain within. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the course. I just wanted to note that for the next chapter, I'm not going to be able to create a video lecture for it, but I will post the slides. I apologize for that, so please read over the lecture slides and the textbook for that chapter. Okay, well, thank you again, and I'll give you some more information on the final exam shortly. All right, take care and have a great day. Bye.